Across the Sun by Jason Pagano and Bill Robinson. Chapter 36, Close Range. The two skeletons Azacca had been pursuing exploded about a dozen paces ahead of him. Shelfie veered away from the hail of rock and debris, then circled around to the man standing some distance behind them. A human smacked his palm against his shaved head. He seemed angered by the flameless blast. Most of the shrapnel had not reached him, but some chunks had bounced off the heavy wooden shield he'd reflexively held up. He looked up just in time to see something else sailing toward him. The blue pellet hitting his shield shattered as a mighty shockwave caught him off guard, knocking him down. Azacca was pleased with his first hit and loaded another magical boomstone into his sling. He figured some mindless skeletons wouldn't simply align forces with humans, and that this pale, white human lurking behind them had something to do with them being there. As the dust settled, the human rolled to his side, watching the halfling ranger. He dropped his shield, propping himself up so he could begin casting a spell. He extended his hairy, muscular arm, which began to throb and fade to a sickly gray color as his fingers turned black. The halfling pitched another boomstone at the human as he and the bobcat ran closer. Then an oily streak of black fluid shot forward, covering his stone and sinking it to the ground, rendering it ineffective. The fluid sprayed his side and hip, and the searing pain of the man's necrosis spell caused his small body to seize up. He toppled off his mount. Shelfie, trained for combat, continued to pursue the assailant. She pounced on him as he was scrambling to retrieve something from a large pouch on his belt. The bobcat pinned him down and dug her claws into his muscular bare chest. Before he could scream, she had her jaws around his throat. Blood leaked out of his mouth as the bobcat tore his major arteries. As the last signs of struggle left his body, his hand relaxed, and two small bones rolled to the earth. Aeden had run up the slope, pursuing the other man. As he raced, he wondered why this human was only walking. From afar, he could only see the man's dark-skinned head. Cresting the hill, Aeden saw the man's shoulders and flowing clothing and his sinister smile as he drew his bow. The man shot Aeden from 100 paces away, the arrow buried into the flesh just below his collarbone. Dark magenta fluid leaked from the wound before he'd started to bleed. The eldest sibling howled in pain, dropping the sword from the hand of his pinched arm. Aeden reached to pull the arrow out, then realized doing so could cause more pain or damage. Would this archer fire another arrow at him? He took the risk, grabbing his sword with his offhand. Another arrow whizzed by his leg. Another splash of reddish purple hit a rock behind him, a broken arrow lying nearby. That time, he'd been lucky. His sword was for close combat. It was a weapon for melee. Aeden would be vulnerable if he ran headlong into the open range. He'd have to be evasive. Rocks and trees were scattered across the divide, but taking cover would only give his foe more time to knock another arrow and aim. He weaved as he ran. He thought he'd only need to dodge 3 or 4 more arrows from close range. The next arrow stuck into a tree near Aiden's head. There was an explosion, and he saw Azacca hit the ground, but Aeden had no time to check on him now. Aeden collapsed against a tree as the next arrow impaled his abdomen. He didn't want to look at it sticking out of him, pointing to his mortality. The man had smirked after striking his quarry a second time. Aeden struggled to dismiss his feelings of dread and defeat dragging down his wounded body. The archer's smirk disappeared, replaced by bewilderment as he saw Aeden continue to advance despite his injuries. Absently, he dropped an opened vial, spilling a magenta fluid across the ground. Fumbling, he squatted to collect it. Cursing, he stood again to knock an uncoated arrow. Aeden now stood before the man, glaring. Using what little strength he had, he swung his sword, cutting the man's bowstring.
How?
The archer's bow recoiled, causing the arrow to slip from his fingers. The man stumbled, catching himself against a large rock. Another explosion knocked Aeden back. He screamed in pain, and with the arrow still protruding from his abdomen, he couldn't sit up. Instead, he rolled onto his side, propping himself up on his elbow. The rock had a nasty scorch mark above the archer's remains. The blast had mutilated his clothing and skin, and parts of his skull had sunk into his bald head. Aeden quickly looked away. As his healing hands expelled the arrow from his gut and closed the deep wound, he gingerly touched behind his ears. The sounds of battle had returned with his hearing. He looked for the source of the explosions and saw Azacca collapsed, his body blackening quite unnaturally. As soon as the wound closed up, he'd rush over to help. His other injury could wait. Azacca could no longer feel his left arm, and he struggled to support his weight on it as he fumbled for another boomstone to place in his sling. Using his dominant hand, he pitched another stone into the trees. The blast took out a few large branches, which came down around the gnome auctioneer. He'd been off to the side, observing the battle with a lazed interest. Now he became much more alert. While healing, Aeden had watched the halfling continue to battle even in his injured state. With this last explosion, Aeden finally noticed where the gnome had retreated. Then he saw him casting a spell. Surprisingly, it was one the human recognized. With a few arcane words and hand gestures, the gnome began jogging away as a tailwind spell caught his feet and propelled him quickly through the woods.
I got chickens with bigger eggs!
Azacca hollered at the fleeing gnome, then groaned from the physical exertion. The necrotic swath across his body had continued to blister and spread. Any movement caused his skin to split and bleed. Finally, the arrow emerged from Aiden's abdomen, dropping to the ground as the wound closed. A strange fluid that stuck to his clothing and skin had begun to bubble and sizzle. It smelled terrible. The bobcat raced after the gnome auctioneer, but she failed to gain on him. Hearing Azacca in pain, Shofi raced back to the ranger's side. She howled as her companion collapsed, no longer moving. Aeden stood up and winced as the arrow in his shoulder shifted, then ran to Azacca.
I can do it again. I can do it again.
Aeden said.
I can save him.
He dropped to his knees at the halfling's side. The strange, rotting skin was creeping up Azacca's neck and spreading down his torso. Aeden placed his hands over the blackened flesh. It was cold and lifeless. Although the human felt drained, he knew with more time he'd be able to restore the halfling. Now he hoped and prayed he could get Azacca on his feet. Azacca coughed, opening his eyes to see who was supporting his head. When he saw Aeden looking afraid, he tried to grin and comfort him. The young man was touching his damaged abdomen, though Azacca couldn't feel it. He closed his eyes again in grief.
You got the gift in them human hands, but necrosis done a real number here.
Azacca struggled to say. His breathing had become shallow.
I'll heal you.
With Aiden's touch, the rotten flesh began to stop its creeping over the halfling's body. Then Aeden felt a sudden and horrible feeling of emptiness. The healing ceased, and the rotting showed no further signs of abating. His special ability had been exhausted. He felt powerless. When the halfling didn't respond, Aeden shouted for any sign of attention.
Zach!
My good girl.
Azacca said quietly, not opening his eyes. Aeden was confused until he saw Shofi bounding to Azacca's side. The bobcat pressed her head against her companion's head. Aeden wondered why her face lacked emotion. Shofi suddenly looked at Aeden.
Don't get more time than this, I'm afraid, my boy.
The giant animal spoke in Azacca's voice.
Not a boy, my good man.
The young human, overwhelmed with emotion, reacted with wide, curious eyes filled with shock and sorrow.
Damn, 'cause death ain't bad enough. I gotta curse Tika something worse. Tell Mama I'm sorry. Y'all are the good ones. Shofi and me, we knew it.
The bobcat let out an otherworldly, tragic roar. She closed her eyes and pressed her head to the halfling's chest, which was no longer drawing breath. Aeden gently lowered the halfling's body to the ground. Amidst the combat around them, Shofi did not move again. Aeden sat on his heels, leaning forward as though he were about to collapse. He began to hyperventilate. His healing, which had saved him and his siblings from many injuries, had failed. He'd failed to protect someone. The battle wasn't over. Aeden had exhausted the ability he'd thought would help him through anything, but he had to keep fighting. He stood, facing the distant sounds of battle. His heart was telling him something. His recurring nightmare was about to change.
There will be a new face by the fire,
he thought to himself. Chapter 37. Blades and Chains. Surmounting the hill, Clyde willed herself to ignore the unfavorable combat conditions. At least 2 formidable-looking elves were eyeing her from higher ground. If they were allied with that nefarious auctioneer, they might have their sights set on Mitra. Regardless of their target or vantage, the young rogue would bring the fight to the elves first. At twice her height, Mandragora Rose had the advantage of a longer gait. Clyde hadn't noticed her dashing by because of the camouflage of her fine combat attire. The young Tika sprinted to keep up. Shaking off her feelings of inadequacy, she rushed into combat armed with a pilfered kitchen knife. Across the way, Clyde saw her brother Rakaru heading toward the older elf, who appeared to smugly anticipate the challenge. The younger elf stood uphill of Clyde, his arms relaxed and both hands holding daggers. This elven man was tall and lean, like her brother. As Mandragora Rose drew closer, the elf flashed a toothy grin. In the blink of an eye, he shot forth a hand, releasing a dagger. The Tikas dropped, rolling to the side and using a rock to take cover. Disbelieving her own eyes, she saw the dagger he'd thrown had split into 5 identical daggers, now fanning out in an arc. Lying flat behind the rock, Clyde listened for more combat noises or the camouflaged woman gasping in pain. She leapt up to witness the man throwing more daggers at the woman. Tracking Mandragora Rose was difficult. Nonetheless, Clyde could tell the barrage of daggers was preventing her from closing ranks. The Tika sprinted around to flank their opponent, but halted when she noticed something peculiar about his combat style. The elf was throwing 5 daggers from his left hand over and over, but never replacing them with the 1 dagger in his right hand. Was this a remarkable sleight of hand technique, drawing 5 more daggers from his shirt sleeve? She had now seen him throw 10 daggers, somehow with 1 still in each hand. This must be some sort of arcana. This ambush had been orchestrated by elite fighters who were augmenting their skills. Even the elven woman, an unexpected ally, was likely using arcana to enhance her stealthy defenses. The Tikas had faced arcana when training with Gorm's uncanny image spells, so she edged into the melee, trusting her mind over her eyes. These were the stakes of real combat, she thought. The young elf spotted Clyde approaching and turned to pitch another volley of daggers. The last dagger sailed right through the Tikas' chest. Mandragora Rose seized this opportunity to reach for her magnificent spiked chain. With a skillful pitch, she sliced the man's right hand, disarming the dagger. As that dagger fell, the one in his other hand vanished. Clyde had sustained no injury. Her conviction had kept her sprinting toward the enemy and ignoring the illusion of a dagger from the elf's blade spray spell. The young elf, startled for only an instant, dropped into a tumble and collected his weapon. The Tikas was about to leap at the man, but her ally, with a precise snap of her chain, had already caught the man by the neck. The choking man looked desperately at the older elven woman. He tried to call out, but no sound came. As the flush of blood appeared in his face and his eyes began to bulge, Clyde saw his tears and an unmistakable look of pure dread. With unmatched strength, Mandragora Rose yanked the young man back. His flailing body lifted off the ground, only to collide with her raised knee to his spine. His bloody head hit the ground, but he surprised both of his combatants with his reclaimed dagger. He buried the blade in the elven woman's thigh, nearly causing her to collapse onto him. Clyde leapt onto him, stabbing between his shoulder blades. The dull kitchen knife glanced off his spine, causing the blade to slip deeper into his torso. Clyde jumped off the man's broken back. The young elf, barely older than her, moaned before collapsing face first into the dirt. His body, a knife protruding from it, lay still. Clyde was winded and unarmed. She looked up at the woman who'd fought alongside her and considered reaching for the kitchen knife once more.
Haven't seen a true Tikas in ages.
Mandragora Rose said, breathing heavily.
Good work, young one.
I'm Clyde.
Was all the Tikas could think to say. She was staring at the dagger still stuck in the woman's leg. The wound looked very bad.
I have to go take care of this.
The woman clenched her teeth and pulled out the dagger. After wincing and taking a deep breath, she offered the Tikas the weapon.
I'd say you earned this upgrade.
Clyde's eyes widened as she noticed a dark pink fluid on the blade and seeping from the woman's wound. She accepted the dagger, handling it carefully.
Not good.
Mandragora Rose examined the residue.
I can't believe they attacked children. Protect your friends, Clyde.
Flicking her wrist, her spiked chain coiled against her side. Then, she disappeared into thin air. Clyde had felt the elf woman's hand. Neither her ally nor her opponent were illusion or hallucination. Mandragora Rose had disappeared like the other mysterious people Clyde had seen when she was alone. She'd seen Azacca before, but he'd never disappeared. In the distance, she saw him on the ground, Aeden tending to him. In the valley, Niwa and Mitra were huddled together. Mitra seemed alert, but unafraid. Clyde wondered what Mandragora Rose had meant by calling her a true Tikus. Mitra was as much a Tikus and a person as she. Clyde was certain of that. Chapter 38, Boneyard. Niwa felt surprisingly unafraid. She gripped her doha. She could do more than just watch her siblings risk their lives. Her brother had asked her to protect Mitra, and she'd done exactly that. She saw Azacca was down, but he and Shofi had destroyed their enemies. She worried for him, but Aeden was helping now. On the opposite slope, Mandragora Rose and Clyde had defeated another opponent. The summoned woman had disappeared, and the shield she had offered for protection vanished along with her. Beyond the barrier, the creepy, slain human had dropped some bones. Niwa noticed these bones starting to rattle of their own accord. She watched them with caution and curiosity. Then, the rough terrain cracked and more bones emerged from the earth. As if possessed, the bones organized into two small skeletons.
I'll be right back,
She told Mitra, a lump forming in her throat. She feared endangering Mitra as much as she did attacking two monsters by herself. Newly reconstituted, the skeletons ambled toward Aeden, who looked very desperate as he knelt beside Azacca and Shofi. The young summoner ran her doha along the invisible barrier, the arcane force field shimmering where the copper pipe touched it, as she attempted to skirt around it. As Niwa found the edge a few more paces down the valley, she realized Arcana had animated these skeletons. It pained her that someone was manipulating the remains of real people for his own wicked purposes. Neither skeleton had noticed Niwa advancing behind them. She easily caught up and bashed one skull with her doha. The clumsy figure recoiled and wobbled, but did not fall. The other skeleton rotated its skull and tried to bite her. Niwa successfully dodged, but flinched at the opportunity to counterattack. Never seeing a skeleton before today, she had understood these were bones that previously belonged to living people, but she felt an intense grief realizing these were Tikus skeletons. They had uniquely shaped skulls, and long strings of tiny bones that were unmistakably their tails. Whoever was ambushing them not only worked with slavers, but corrupted and exploited Tikus even after death. She attacked. She knew they were no longer Tikus, and she needed to protect her family, but this horrid truth racked her mind. Niwa felt herself grow weak, but she ignored her anger and tears and kept swinging furiously. The skeletons, unarmed, didn't put up much of a challenge. After several more strikes, Niwa had smashed the Tikus skeletons back into scattered bones. She closed her eyes and leaned on her doha, breathing deeply and trying to organize her emotions. Then she heard Shofi howl. The sorrowful sound resonated through her, and she found the energy to rise and keep walking. Chapter 39, Groundswell. Rukaria ran for the elven woman. She watched him advance, no emotion on her face. Neither brandished a weapon, which made him guess she was also a magic user. He was giving himself time to consider what spells to use while serving as decoy to protect Mitra and his sister. The woman watched Rukaria press against scattered rocks to aid his climb, judging him from above. Once he'd closed half the distance between them, she raised one arm high. Her dark-skinned, slender hand extended from the sleeve of her oversized jacket as if trying to catch rain. The young mage halted. He guessed the woman was theatrically preparing to cast a spell at him. What spell would she cast? Running up that hill could wait for now. He tried to recall anything Gorm had ever said about counterspelling, which wasn't much. They'd never practiced casting a spell to counter or nullify another spell in action. He was frustrated. The only spells that came to mind involved water, and he couldn't block a litany of spells using only water. The expressionless, elegant elven sorceress stared at him, muttering a few words. Rikaryu couldn't hear what she was saying, although she appeared to mouth the word toxicity, which chilled him. Rikaryu needed to start casting something. Something about engaging with an unknown danger, as opposed to seeing an enemy charging, weapons drawn, didn't spur adrenaline in him. With water still on his mind, he hurriedly spoke the arcane words, leaning forward and smacking the ground with his open hand. The woman finished casting first, and she lowered her cupped hand, which held a small heap of bright white powder. With hardly a toss, she released the toxicity into the air. Glittering whiteness burst all around Rikaryu after the powder hit him in the chest. The sorceress brushed her hands together as she watched him begin to struggle and choke violently. Rikaryu had felt the groundwater rumbling as his hand had touched the ground. From the rocky terrain, his sluice spell erupted just behind the elven woman. An immense geyser burst through the earth, tilting large stones aside from the pressure. Water cascaded down the slope, taking with it everything that wasn't deeply embedded in the terrain. Rikaryu's spell had caught the sorceress completely off guard. The water flushed her down the slope, battering her willowy body against large rocks along the way. She might have tried to cast another spell while the sluice took her. She might have tried to grab onto him on the way down to save her from drowning or blunt force trauma. Rikaryu couldn't be sure. He was being destroyed by the arcane poison. He collapsed, experiencing devastation from the inside out. Mitra stood to see the once formidable elven sorceress, who had literally washed up only a stone's throw away. After the rushing water had moved on, the woman spasmed before trying to stand back up. Mitra remembered the elf looking down at her. The sorceress had killed the father of her first litter with one of her spells, with poison. Mitra thought about the concept of fate and all the experiences she'd faced since that awful day. Was fate simply cruel to everyone? Then she recognized the young elf further along the slope. He was that woman's son, now a grown man, and Atticus had just killed him. Mitra had no room in her heart for forgiveness or pity. Though she believed no person had the right to decide who should live or die, this was a time for self-defense. This woman and her cohort had pursued her, and were she able to stand up again, she'd certainly kill them all. Reaching into her pocket, Mitra retrieved the boomstone Azacca had given her the night before. Unsure of its usage, she followed his example and hurled the blue stone at the sorceress, hitting a nearby rock. The concussive blast killed the woman instantly, tearing her upper body asunder. That fight was over, and fate had been sealed. The Atticus had never looked away. Rikaryu was no longer coughing or writhing around. Moving or even drawing a breath felt as if knives were punching through the ribbons left inside his body. The rushing water he'd evoked came crashing down on him. He remained stable as everything else washed away. The cleansing cascade absorbed the cloud of life-destroying powder. During agonizing pain, the water was relief, enveloping him in cooling, nourishing pressure. The water from the sluice spell was finite. It would move downhill momentarily. For now, though, Rikaryu felt covered and tranquil. His body surrendered, and he collapsed, no longer breathing. Chapter 40. Ultramarine. Rikaryu wasn't sure if he were asleep. His body wanted to shut down. The thought of surrendering to death horrified him, but ending his suffering seemed so pleasantly simple. Life was struggle and survival. Now he felt a strange sense of permission to leave this place. Unable to open his eyes, he tried to imagine his siblings, but with little success. He tried to see Gorm and Saba. then Ulysses from Raven's Cross for some reason. He couldn't visualize them clearly either. Had he thought of the little blind girl because he felt blind himself? He hadn't said goodbye to anyone. Even succumbing to a poison to death felt stressful. Frustrated and in pain, he tried to imagine what a deathbed might look and feel like. In his fugue, he decided he must get comfortable on his deathbed before being allowed to die. Rokaru considered this rough ground and remembered the other night, his body floating in crystal clear water. He wished more than anything he could rest in that water again. This wish made him rally. He became aware of all the water that constituted his body. It felt as pristine as it always had, even as the elven part of him was fading away.
Oxbow,
Rokaru's voice said from somewhere.
I love you.
The ground rumbled beneath him. Against his back, he felt cracks and small fissures separating the earth. Rokaru willed his body to liquefy. Although he couldn't see anything, he felt pieces of himself slipping through these cracks. Each piece slid down like draining water, and each droplet contained a small portion of his pain. The pieces slipped and cascaded off the jagged ground, continuing to fall deeper and deeper. The earth ended, leaving no more solid objects to avoid. The watery essence of Rokaru fell like rain, striking the surface of a large body of water. He winced as countless minuscule smacks of pain rippled along the surface, but the pain was replaced with bursts of cool relief piercing the water.
I am yours again when we meet beneath the waves,
replied Oxbow in a soothing voice.
I love you, my bulwark.
Rokaru could see under the water. Muted rays of light refracted and swayed as pieces of his elven body drifted away. He no longer felt any pain.
What's happening to me?
Rokaru asked mentally. He wanted to hear Oxbow's voice again, saying anything at all.
We are the Jinn, and we can wash away a mortal's poison.
The voice of Oxbow answered, sounding almost wistful.
The Jinni inside of you is why you are still alive. I have searched for you for so long.
Jinn was a term he knew, but must have heard only as a young child. The word became evasive, slipping around his mind as he tried to grasp it. A Jinni was inside him. He could feel this more fully now. The entity was under the water, watching the elven pieces of Rokaru slowly floating away. The Jinni saw the arcane poison, which now looked like pointillism on a murky canvas streaked with paint.
If only I could hold you even longer, Rook. Say you'll return to the ocean and come back to me.
Oxbow's hand reached into the water and beckoned tenderly. The Jinni, removed from Rokaru, swam to the beckoning hand. Swimming felt so natural and invigorating. Oxbow clasped the hand, pulling from above. Rokaru experienced the Jinni's movements. Cool water trickled down his arm. The air above chilled him slightly. He could finally see the Oxbow, who watched him with sorrowful but kind eyes. Rokaru remembered the face immediately somehow, but was still stunned. Oxbow was handsome, with smooth features that shimmered as clear water swirled through his turquoise skin. He resembled a round, yet muscular human, with indistinct legs binding with the water.
Your siblings need you, Rook,
said Oxbow.
They love you as much as I.
I've always loved you, haven't I?
Rokaru asked. He was pulled to his feet. As he stood on the water's surface, the elven pieces of him coalesced and reformed.
In one form or another,
Oxbow said with a wan smile. He was still holding Rokaru's elven hand as he began to sink into the water.
I want to go back to the ocean with you,
Rokaru said. As he grasped and pulled Oxbow's hand, the elf noticed bright turquoise color edging up his own dark amber forearm.
So come back,
Oxbow said. His rugged body faded as his form merged with the water like a melting ice sculpture.
We have so much work to do and so much traveling to enjoy together. I will hold you in my arms again soon, Rook.
I will.
Rokaru forced out the words quickly. Sadness and lust choked his voice. Oxbow was almost gone. Desperately, the restored mage attempted to pull him back. His right forearm pulsing turquoise as he strained to hoist Oxbow back from the depths. His sinewy body flexed and tightened in his struggle until the breaking point. His beautiful stranger was gone. When Rokaru pulled his hand from the water, his forearm disintegrated as thousands of droplets of water splashed away. All the tension he'd been holding was released, causing him to fall back. He closed his eyes, trying to forget the fall, to imagine a better life in the depths of the water. Chapter 41. Heaviness. With great sorrow, the siblings had continued on to Obery's house. The surrounding landscape didn't feel familiar anymore. They were distressed to see the chimney missing and no candlelight through the windows as night was beginning to fall. Clyde guided the group around the ward and barrier spells protecting the house. The Tikas found herself halting occasionally to get her bearings. Her stress had affected her alertness. She couldn't hear anybody coming, but she was struggling to trust her senses. Aeden followed behind her with Rokario's body in his arms. He was the only sibling strong enough to carry him, despite his injuries. He was desperately trying to make sense of their situation. He assumed his siblings looked to him for answers and leadership. Yet Aeden had failed to protect the entire group, and he felt devastating guilt. Right then, his primary concern was how to explain any of this to Obery. Niwa and Mitra walked alongside the bobcat, who carried Azacca's body. Today, Niwa had experienced loss for the first time. She couldn't bring herself to think about her brother or Azacca, and had almost deluded herself into thinking everything would be fine once they arrived home. She tried to stay focused on Mitra, who was stoic and silent beside her. The young gnome understood Mitra had experienced awful violence before, and she felt immature wondering how today compared with those other tragedies. For now, the simple act of holding hands would be enough to show her compassion and solidarity. On the next episode, the family shatters as the siblings return to Obery's house following the ambush in the valley. They have nowhere else to turn, but Obery still rejects their presence.
This is all too much. I'm sorry for what has happened to you all, but I can't have you children bringing war to my home. We're far too vulnerable as it is.
Reluctantly, the dwarf woman agrees to help Mitra and let Rokario stay in the hopes he regains consciousness. Aeden and Niwa try to explain the situation about Azacca.
He said he knew we were friendly.
We were the good ones.
Obery remains doubtful of their intentions until Clyde finally speaks up.
I am a Tikas. This is my family. If you are rescuing the Tikas, then we're with you.
Obery finally explains where they can go with Mitra and be safe.
You already know there's a place for that. It's been my mission to keep it safe.
Can the siblings find this place on their own? Chapter 42, The Need to Know. Next time on Across the Sun. Across the Sun Episode 8 was voiced by Danielle Bouchard as Clyde, Julia Boudreau as Niwa, Bill Robinson as Aeden, Jason Pagano as Rokario, Daniel Neal as Azacca, Alicia Robinson as Obery, Sarah Luz as Mitra, Shannon Brennan as Mandragora Rose, James Stacy as Oxbow. Additional voices by Lucian Opilo. Narrated by, edited, scored, mixed, and mastered by Thomas Wells. Some sound effects and music acquired from Zapsplat.com.